Okay, it looks like everybody's coming in from our waiting room, and it's time to get started with our coffee chat for today. So welcome everyone to our coffee chat. It's cold outside and it's a great day to be sitting around with a coffee and having a chat. So thank you for joining us. I'm Karen Waters. I'm a member of ILA's Sustainability Strategy for Boards Working Committee, and I'll be doing the moderating for today's chat. As you know, at ILA, it's our objective and aim to promote best practices in the field of corporate governance. And the Sustainability Strategy for Boards Committee has launched this series of online coffee chats to help directors hear from their peers about key topics related to sustainability and corporate strategy. Today's session is the last in our current series, which has covered sustainable finance, green IT, and the CSRD. If you've missed those, don't worry, because there's an executive summary of each chat, as well as recordings of the chat on ILA's sustainability resource website. And the team will be sharing in the coffee chat the link to that resource site. It will be here at the beginning and it's come up. Thank you. And I'll share it again at the end, just in case you've missed it. So these conversations are just a starting point. We hope that they will enable you to engage in dialogue with your fellow board members, build a shared understanding of sustainability, and develop a roadmap and concrete actions for advancing sustainability within your organization. So it's sort of the let's learn and let's discuss and let's share and make the group who's become aware even larger. So today with us for discussing the CS3D, we will be hearing from Frédéric Vonner. Frédéric is a PwC partner. He is currently focused on sustainability and sustainable finance and assists asset managers and banks from strategy to implementation to regulatory compliance. He has over 20 years of experience managing and advising asset managers and asset services, with a focus on operational excellence and regulatory compliance for both UCITS and alternative funds. And on a personal note, because the person is more important than just what they do, he is reported to be a very respected leader that takes good care of his teams. And I've also heard that although he looks pretty serious, he has a mischievous sense of humor. So Frédéric, let's see what we find in today's presentation. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. I think everybody's used to online meetings now, but just to remind you, this session is being recorded. And today's session is a presentation. It's like we're in a bit of a classroom, but we would like this to be interactive. So please do ask your questions as we go along. In order to ask a question, you can either type it in the chat, or you can just type, "I would like to ask a question," and then we'll ask you to open your mic and you can actually articulate your question directly. So don't wait till the end. You can ask your questions in between and we can have more of a flow and dialogue. So Fred, we have a lot to cover today. And I took this summary from the EU website of what is the corporate sustainability and supply chain due diligence. The aim of CS3D is to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior in companies' operations and across their global value chains. The new rules will ensure that companies in scope identify and address adverse human rights and environmental impacts of their actions inside and outside Europe. And additionally, the directive establishes a corporate due diligence duty for large companies, or for those in scope, and for large companies, an obligation to adopt and put into effect, through best efforts, a transition plan for climate change mitigation. So that's a lot. I mean, we're talking about global value chains. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about environment. We're talking about inside and outside of Europe, and both a duty and an obligation, respectively, on due diligence and environmental roadmap. So we've got a lot to cover. So I'm going to hand over to you so you can shed some light on this wide-ranging directive. The floor is yours, Fred.
Thanks a lot, Karen, and good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you this morning in this cold morning, as Karen alluded on. Let's see whether you'll be able to enjoy my specific sense of humor talking about CS3D. Not sure I will manage, but thanks for the challenge, Karen. Challenge accepted. Indeed, we're talking, and we'll be talking this morning about regulation that is upcoming. So we have a good view as to what are the principles and what is the context that the Commission has been putting around that regulation that is, again, and you'll see that in a minute, is coming in a few years' time. Maybe just to set the scene, especially moving from one of the previous sessions you had about CSRD versus CF3D. And Karen, very much building on what you said, CF3D is about corporate behaviors. It's about what are the processes, how a corporate should behave with respect to human rights and environmental protection. CSRD, as you might have heard last time, is much more initially seen as a reporting directive. So it's less prescriptive when it comes to take actions and do things. The action taking being much more focused on the CS3D than CSRD. Yet obviously, coping and engaging on discussion on CSRD aims at having a good baseline, a good first view as to how a company is doing in various ESG dimensions, with the hope that the company will do better in those dimensions. Yet the requirement to do better and to have actions is in the context of CF3D. So what is CF3D about? As you said, Karen, it's a directive, so we'll still have to wait, obviously, for the transposition into national laws that aims at standardizing a certain number of good practices, enforcing behaviors in very large corporates within the EU, and we'll see the scope a bit later, in order to mitigate risks and the impact that the corporate might have in the fields of human rights and environment. One of the difference with CSRD is that CF3D, as you pointed out, Karen, has effects that are going beyond the EU borders. We're looking at any impact, any effect that a company based or operating in the EU might have outside of the EU, very much looking into how the value chains of those companies are being managed, operated for the good of human rights and environment. The scope of application of CF3D is a bit different again than CSRD. It applies only to large companies in the sense of the EU Accounting Directive, with application dates starting 2027. Most of the requirements kicking in actually in 2028. So again, if I compare with CF3D, which is happening now, we still have a bit of time to see major companies and large companies coping and engaging heavily into CS3D compliance. What are, in 2 words, the new obligations of corporates under CS3D? It's about making sure that those large companies do identify, assess, prevent the potential adverse impact that they might have themselves or indirectly via their providers or suppliers and potentially clients, also all the stakeholders in the value chain, on human rights and environmental issues. The point being, obviously, to have those companies and large companies stopping, for example, activities, if those activities do not or do impact negatively at a too high level human rights and or environmental matters. We're talking a lot about human rights in CS3D vis-a-vis CSRD. CSRD is a bit more on the E dimension focus from the ESG. You might have heard sometimes people talking about the Human Rights Directive, also when talking about CS3D. It is about human rights. It's not only about human rights. It's also about the environmental impact that large companies might have. Again, it is quite a bold move, I will say, from the EU as an economic bloc to impose those kind of requirements to large companies, because what we're doing here is that we're forcing good behaviors on companies. And we're forcing the large companies adopting good behaviors in how they operate and how they source material, how they rely on their own operations to deliver the products and services that they do deliver. But also, and that's the side effect, say, of CS3D, is because CS3D is requiring those large companies to look into their value chain. We expect CS3D to have kind of cascade effects or ripple effects on the various stakeholders that those large companies have into their value chain. So even if a company is not in the scope of CS3D down the road in 2027, 28, because a company located in the EU or outside of the EU will provide services, material, goods, products to a company in scope of CS3D, the expectation is that the good practice that will be imposed on the large company will impact also the smaller players around those large companies. So all the ecosystem that the large companies are operating with is expected to be impacted by the good behaviors that will be imposed on the large companies. So that's very much the idea of the directive, to say that we focus on large corp, but end with, I was about to say, the hope that there is a positive effect upstream, downstream, in terms of those large corp imposing and encouraging also good behaviors in companies not in scope. Which means also that if we look at how the board of those large companies should be looking into CS3D, there is a number of, I was about challenges or attention points, I believe that the board and that the non-executive at the board should be looking into. CS3D, as you might understand, is about good behaviors. And good behaviors, to me, cannot happen if there's no strong top-down approach. It must be, board-driven decision and actions. It must be the C-suite that are, impulsing and creating the frame for good behaviors within the corporate, within the company. Which means that obviously, as some of you sitting potentially in the board are being engaged with boards of those large companies, there is a strong, I was about to say need, but because I'm convinced of the importance of the topic, but there's a strong interest, say, at least, for directors sitting in board or being engaged in the board of those companies to make sure that the topic is looked at early enough so that nobody wakes up late, as we might see for the time being with CSRD, for example. In that scope, to make sure that from a governance standpoint, that from an accountability standpoint, the board is making sure that all across the organization, through all the different functions of the company, those good practices when it comes to human rights and environmental and due diligencing on the value chain are being enforced and are being rolled out. And this is where I very much see the impact of a non-executive director in that context, which is, to me, to guide, to explain, to provide the outer view as to potentially what is the market perception of a large corp when it comes to human rights and environmental aspects. What is the good practices that are observed on the market? Potentially also, how can you advise as a non-executive director, how can you advise a large corp or a company operating in the ecosystem of a large corp to take advantage of CS3D to anticipate potentially certain of the requirements in order to create a competitive advantage for the companies you engage with vis-a-vis CS3D. Obviously, there's also, if I look at the, if I continue looking at the board of the directors role, there is a more traditional, I would say, expectation, which is about ensuring alignment and compliance. Looking ex post, how a corporate has been doing in order to embrace CS3D, what has been put in place, whether it works or not. There is a monitoring role of the board of directors when it comes to the compliance with CS3D, but I'm about to say it is nothing different than ensuring compliance and monitoring compliance with any type of regulation. Yet again, my perception, and Karen and I, we had a quick chat before the a pre-coffee chat, I must say, on that topic. If we look at the scope of companies and how CS3D has been crafted against CSRD, the scope of companies is much smaller. You might have followed the debates that happened at the when the text has been defined. Some of the stakeholders arguing that CS3D is playing against the EU large corporates by imposing on them requirements that are not at the same level than large corp operating or being based in other economic blocks. Yes, potentially. And it's very likely that we don't have such many of those large corp being based in Luxembourg. Yet, being a non-exec of a Luxembourg company or wherever the companies you're engaged with are based, even if the companies you're operating with are not in the scope of CS3D, I think there is still a valid check to do, which is engaging with the rest of the board and the executive of the company that you engage with in order to ensure, to understand what will be the positioning and the engagement that the company you're operating with will have towards companies that will be in scope of CS3D. Again, because of this cascade/ripple effect. So even if you might say it will happen in a long time, my company, if I may say so, or the company I'm sitting at the board of, is not impacted directly. Yes, not directly, but potentially there might be side effects, which are valued to be considered already now. One of the side effects of CS3D could be as simple as one of the large clients of one of the company you're operating with decide to stop operating with that company because that company is not fulfilling completely their standards. So losing a major piece of business is obviously something that you should engage on, at least in terms of risk management for the sustainability for the future of the company you're operating with.
Thank you, Fred, for bringing that home to the local market, because I think that's quite important to message. As ILA, we were involved in giving comments on the EU directive in the discussion stages. And our feeling was that, everybody should be included in this because this is about good business. And I think it's interesting how the regulators have now crafted the directive so that although the scope seems small, it actually is encompassing everyone. So that trickle down is real because you will not be working with the big companies if you have not met the same standards as they're required to do so. So I think it's a key message that it doesn't matter if you're in scope or not, you better understand this and your board better be talking about it. One of the other things that was in the directive to start with, of course, as directors, we all have a fiduciary duty, but they were trying to put greater layers of civil liability within the directive as well. Are there any of these still lingering in the directive in the final result, or has there been enough pushback from the market to remove those from the stick?
The pushback has been successful, Karen. Maybe for going to your point, and to the very first statement that you made, I think CS3D is nothing more than good governance. Yes, the scope might be, and I come back to that, but it's nothing more than ensuring that the people you work with are the right people to work with. So it's as basic as that. Yet to your point about liability, including the director's liability, for those of you who have followed the journey, which might have been epic at certain times, there have been a number of back and forth on a number of points of the directive. One being, or several amongst them being, what companies are in scope, and whereas the initial scope was much larger than what we have for the time being, we end up in a situation where we have across the EU something like 10,000 companies that will be in scope, directly in scope of the directive. There was also one of the key elements that was pushed by the Commission, which was to say, we want directors, so you guys, to be directly responsible of the achievement and the compliance of the directive. There have been a number of pushback, which has been successful, at least so far in the text that we have for the time being, which doesn't mean that there will be no revision later on, or that if you look at the level 2 regulation, they might not come back to that topic in terms of ensuring that someone is liable, and who else if not the board ultimately. That board liability and directors liability is also to be looked at not only at the in connection with the CS3D and the potential level 2 requirements that will come later. But you should know that there are already certain member states. We have local regulations, local requirements that are very close to CS3D in terms of concept. So watch out the local requirements. I'm thinking about France, thinking about Netherlands, Germany, for example. Watch out the local requirements that might exist already today in those countries as to who will be liable. I will not be surprised that down the road, if there is no liability put at or forced from an EU directive level or EU regulatory text level, we still have certain local member states, not local member states imposing similar requirements for their local companies. I said we already have in Germany a frame that is very close to CF3D in terms of ensuring that downstream the value chain, so upstream, the providers of products and goods to a company is operating well. To be seen to what extent those countries or similar countries might wish to, just to reinforce and to do a little bit of gold plating around the transposition of CF3D. So the scope, the liability of directors, which is out. The one point also that was key and that has been pushed out of the CF3D is for financial companies. So typically banks, credit institutions, whereby there was a questions around whether the bank is liable towards the value chains of its clients. So you can imagine a local banks financing a local corporate, to what extent the local bank is liable for how the local corporate is relying on a third party located in Bangladesh, for example, to produce anything. So for the time being, this has been taken out of the directive, but subject to a revision. So to me, there is a certain number of clauses in the directive, which will allow for I don't know whether it's going to be CF3D version 2.0 or 1.5, but at least there will be certain revision as to how the directive is operating.
Fred, we have a question from Diana asking about, what is the criteria to be in scope?
Yes.
And what is the definition of large companies? Are you going to cover that later? Yeah.
I was checking whether I have it in the slides. I don't remember.
I think it's at the end.
Is it at the end?
Oh, I thought it was, but maybe
I think it was somewhere. Anyway.
But
so
maybe...
I'm sure so it's not in the deck. So the and I'm happy to to update the deck so that you have it in written when it comes to the definition. I don't want to go to all the details, but the scope, so the companies in scope of CF3D are the ones operating in the EU, so not necessarily based in the EU, which have a turnover of above 450 million euros. That's the main criteria that you have to think of. And there are also certain requirements when it comes to the number of employees, which goes beyond the 250 threshold that we have for CSRD. So keep in mind that 450 million is the key, one of the key reference point, whether it's 450 million euros turnover that are derived from one company or for a group of companies. So you see vis-a-vis the threshold that we have within CSRD, which is a 20 million, 40 million, and 250 employees. We are much higher when it comes to the breadth and the impact and the volume of activities. But I'm happy to adjust the slide deck so that you have it in written. Because again, there are differences whether we are talking about EU-based companies or non-EU-based companies operating in the EU. And I don't want to go into too much of the details now. But that's the idea. So again, I don't know, say luckily enough, but we have corporates potentially in Luxembourg that are above 450 million euros as a turnover, but it's not the vast majority.
But I think it's good to remember that there's the must that's set by the criteria, and then there's the trickle down, which also requires you to be active and to think about it. And also, I think an important point that you've mentioned is that there are local country regulations like France and Germany, which are much more stringent than that of the CS3D. So important that your compliance team is looking at those as well.
Yeah. And to that point, you might say, okay, I'm sitting at the board of a Lux company, very much local, not working in the Great Region, for example, on an operational company standpoint. If one of the clients of that Lux company is sitting in France, you're in, because the French client of your client or of the company you're sitting in will require the Lux company to comply with a certain number of rules, because they have to comply with a certain number of rules. So it's as easy as this. All right, so should I move on, Karen, or you have it? Cool. So moving on, if we look into a bit more of details on ESG due diligence and focusing on environmental and human rights as we have in the CF3D, we see basically four main areas where those topics around ESG due diligence have an impact. The first one is everything around governance and how is those ESG considerations being integrated from a strategy standpoint into the definition or the revision of a business model of a company, how the corporate strategy of the company is adjusted basically to take into account those ESG requirements and human rights and environmental considerations. So, and we might come back to that, Karen, having the right accountability structures, whether you want to have or you consider having a subcommittee from the board, or a few people appointed at board level to primarily be in charge of that, or you name it. But having a thought about how ESG, human rights, environmental matters will be considered from a governance standpoint is key to me, because it's not only about knowing that ESG is about protecting biodiversity, reducing greenhouse gas emission, blah blah blah. That requires more and more specific skills, competencies, knowledge that will not be. You will not be able to find those skills, competencies, knowledge being spread equally amongst a group of board members. So how do you rely on the right persons at the governance body within the organization and the corporate you're looking into, to make sure that basically you are provided with the information, with the knowledge that someone else as a SME, subject matter expert, might have developed? To me, it's a key point to know how well you can be accompanied, basically, in understanding what is ESG and how to do diligence on those matters.
And Fred, what are you seeing in the market? Are you seeing boards trying to upscale or upskill their directors? Are we seeing that they actually are setting up sustainability committees as a subcommittee of the board? Is there any trends?
I must say that for CS3D, I don't see a lot happening, because again, it's quite, it's not happening now. Let's face it, 27, 28, it's, God knows what can happen in between now and then. And most of the companies are still trying to find a way through CSRD. Yet what we see at CSRD, which is, I must say, not really reassuring to me, is that we still have a number of corporates whose board are definitely not at the level of understanding the basic concepts. And to me, the issue is that if the board as a governance body, or was about to say the ultimate governance body, is not in a position to understand the basic concept of talking about CSRD now and expanding to CS3D, then I don't see how the board can guide, monitor, define strategic vision, define actions for corporate. So what I see is that there is an effort to upskill and upgrade the knowledge and skills of a certain number of board members. Yet, looking at the Luxembourg market and the size of the market, as well as the specific industries we're working with, the upskilling is very much, has been historically over the last few years, very much focusing on sustainable finance, SFDR, taxonomy, which is great, because taxonomy applies also with CSRD and ties with CS3D. But we're talking about a different level when we talk about CSRD and CS3D. CSRD is very much about understanding how well the company is doing in terms of ESG matters. And I was about to say in French, par charité chrétienne. So because of confidentiality reasons also, I will not give you names, but we're still debating with a large or mid-sized corporate here in Luxembourg. And they're debating internally whether the activity of the corporate has an impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission. As basic as this. And you could say, okay, greenhouse gas emission, we're talking about that since decades, or at least many years. So the concept, the topic, whether the activity of the corporate is having an impact on greenhouse gas emission should not be something too complicated to assess. I can tell you it's a month now that there are ping pong discussions between EXCO members to understand whether yes or no, those greenhouse gas emissions are material in the scope of CSRD. The point has not reached the board, but we still see a lack of maturity on those matters. And unless you find a way to be accompanied by the right SMEs that will help you understanding those concepts, potentially be upskills also on certain of them, I don't see an alternative way for the time being.
I think that's a good point, Fred. You know, if we can't define something that's science, when it comes to human rights, there's this, who is the ethical judge and what is the correct decision? And I think there was a survey across done a few years ago through financial institutions, and there was a desire to have criteria on the human rights side because it just makes it easier because there's a definition rather than you needing to assess it further and take those ethical positions. So I can see how this one is going to play out in terms of your discussion just on greenhouse. Human rights becomes even more difficult. So it's an important one to have at the board. And I think on your initial comment on governance and board readiness, I think it's really important for us and my colleagues as fellow non-executive directors in Luxembourg to be asking to have this on the agenda and to have presentations from the team at headquarters that is working on the analysis and upskilling through training such as ILA or local professionals that have that background. So we can be demanders to ensure that we are ready. We don't need to wait for the company to give it to us. We should be asking for it.
Yeah, agreed. And Karen, just also conscious of time because otherwise I think we can spend the entire morning. A second big area of impact to me is exactly what you just mentioned. When we talk about human rights and social compliance, I doubt that having a common understanding at board level as to what do you want to do as a corporate in terms of human rights will be an easy story. Because for one, they might be looking at equal treatment between men and women. Another one might be looking into or understanding it as a fair salary towards the employees. What is fair? Do you want to impose a max ratio between the top salary and the bottom salary? Don't know. Does it mean that you're looking at making sure that 4 companies below in the value chain are applying the same standards than you, which is a completely different story than just looking at gender balance, for example, within the company. So it will take time, and I doubt that there will be any strict criteria, Karen, as you said, that will be ever there to say, well, tick the box, you do this, you do this, you do this, you're good. In terms of specific actions, it will not work. Between us, that's the reason why the social taxonomy has been posed. Social taxonomy was about having policies and approaches in place, whereas the environmental taxonomy is about criteria. Am I above 50 grams of CO2 emitted? Yes, no, easy. That's in place. Social taxonomy has been posed exactly because of that issue. So as said, CS3D is looking into social rights, human rights, is also looking into environmental impact. This is where the link with CSRD will be a bit easier because CSRD, as said, for the time being, is heavily working on the E aspects of the operations of a corporate. If we look at the taxonomy, as I just said, it's very much about having an environmental taxonomy with certain clearly established environmental objectives. So understanding also what is the impact of the corporate in terms of environmental matters is something that will need to be looked at. Having the right transition plan and making sure that the corporate actually achieves the 50% reduction of CO2 emission that most of corporates have or large corporates have in their roadmap, or being carbon neutral in 2030 or 2050. On that point, I think, and this is where I think that you as a non-executive director have a role to play, is that there's a number of commitments that's been made by many companies. And commitments have been made like 4 or 5 years ago, targeting 2030, 2050. It's still a long time to go. Well, 2030 is tomorrow. If a company wants to make sure that they manage to reduce by half their CO2 emissions by 2030, if they have not started now, forget it. It will not happen. So this is also where, and those ambitions and those nice goals have been set, I said, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, in market conditions, economic conditions, which were potentially better than now. So I think you still have a role also to play to challenge whether the path on which the company are engaged is still aligned with the objectives that they set for themselves. Because I do expect a lot of, I do expect, I don't expect, I don't hope, but I do expect a number of companies to not meet their targets, especially 2030. And those companies might then be subject to nice discussions with NGOs, with investigation journalism, which might just put your name on the head, the front page of forget my name, my words, the front page of a newspaper, which is from the reputation side something very risky to deal with. So I would also encourage you to check and to make sure that you get an understanding as to how the company is doing in terms of managing the ambitions that they set for themselves. Last point and last key element here to consider when we talk about ESG due diligences is obviously how do you do this in practice? How the company is equipped to basically run those ESG due diligences. Again, building on CSRD is up to 1,300 data points. Well, it will never be managed in Excel. Yeah, but that's a fact. So what is the, and I'm not saying that you have to go into all the details of selecting the right tool, but what is the strategy? What is the plan of the corporate to be equipped in order to be able to manage those ESG due diligences on an appropriate basis? Because all this will be subject to external audit. So traceability, your auditability, all the basic requirements that we know for financial data applies the same and will apply the same to non-financial information, which is also a key point, because again, as a non-executive director sitting on the board of the company, you just don't want the company to have an unqualified or qualified audit, or rather qualified audit opinion on non-financial data. This will trigger a certain number of question mark and risk for yourselves also. Moving on, and I will try to be brief on that one. I just want to share here some of the practical steps potentially for you to put in place and to consider from your end when it comes to ensuring good practices. And that works for obviously for CS3D, but between us, that works also for CSRD. We're looking at good practices when it comes to ESG dimensions. Again, CS3D being much more driven by a request for companies to take actions to encourage good behaviors, which is less pregnant into CSRD. First point, as I already said, identifying the key risks. How the company, so what are the value chains of that the company is operating with? Is the company that you're operating with relying heavily on a supplier, for example, that is located in a country where human rights are so and so? Question mark. Based on those key risks, next step will then be to have the right due diligence measures in place, so that even if you have a company that is operating in a country where human rights are so and so, what are the measures that the company is taking in order to make sure that this specific supplier, even if the local framework is not strong, that they have strong policies, procedures, ambitions in place, so that your company, say, is safe and is well governed. So next to those due diligence measures, which helps also baselining a certain number of data points and having a picture as to what is the starting point when it comes to human rights and environmental matters, having the right goals in place. What do I want to achieve? What are my ambitions? Do I want to get rid of any supplier that is operating in a country where human rights are not properly embedded into the local regulatory framework, for example? So what are the goals that you want, the company wants to set for itself? And then obviously engage with the various stakeholders, clients, providers, industry bodies, your peers also, to understand what is done, what is the market trend, what are the expectations, what are the expectations from a regulator, what are the expectations from a client representatives or representative of clients of the company you're operating with. So all those stakeholders will provide the right level of question for you to ask, basically to your board and to the exco of the company you're operating with, to make sure that the risks that I've talked about are properly managed and addressed. And last point, as usually, the monitoring and reporting, well, just good practice. Again, where we see a strong role for non-executive directors is about, as I said earlier on, guiding, monitoring, challenging all this, making sure that ESG is integrated in the various level of operations of the of your company, and then looking at it from a risk-based point of view. My example of for example, having a supplier being based in Bangladesh might not be relevant for many of companies operating in Luxembourg, but there might be others risks that are very much relevant for the company you're engaged with.
Fred, a couple of questions on
Yeah.
some of the elements
Yes.
that are within there. The due diligence measures. Initial discussion was around your supply chain, but the directive moved to value chain. And I'm not sure that everyone understands what that depth means and what it changes. And the second, I'll give you both my questions and the other is around engaging stakeholders. And you already started to talk about it just previously when you talked about brand reputation, not-for-profits. How are you defining your stakeholders and how are companies engaging? What are you seeing on those? So one on the due diligence and the depth of it, and are companies really ready for that? And the other on stakeholders, how do we define, how broad is it, and how do you engage?
I don't know where to start with. So value chains. Yes, the directive is evolved, and again, let's see how the RTS, the level 2, will play this. Initially, the thought was about to look at basically the value chain below the corporate, downward. So say, well, or below, depending on how you look at it, but I'm looking at my suppliers, I'm looking at the people providing me with goods and services, so that I make sure that I buy products, to make it short, that are produced, manufactured by companies which are doing right in terms of human rights and environmental. Next to that, and because there have been a certain number of debates, it's not only about suppliers. Potentially, it's about also making sure that my clients are doing good in terms of human rights and environmental. That wording has been expanded to value chain, which is a bit more upward, downward. So it's corporate in the middle, looking at provider, supplier on one side, and the rest being more clients and purchaser of your good. So value chain must be understood as a broad sense, which leads to the point about who are the stakeholders. obviously, stakeholders will be the two elements of your value chain that are downstream, upstream, but not only. When we look about stakeholders, it is also the employees of a company. It is also the regulator of a company. If the company is regulated, what are the regulatory expectations that are imposed on the company? And what is the administrative practice of the regulator to in certain areas which might not have been transposed into laws for the time being, but we know that this has to be done. So stakeholders is you have to see it as any one who might have an impact on the corporate, or anyone on which the corporate might have an impact on. So depending again on the business of the company, you might have an impact on certain specific communities. So engaging with a representative of those communities is something of importance. So it's not only about who is buying my products, who is selling my products, and the people I use to operate my production of and operations, but it's all the various people around and communities and NGOs and bodies around that can help understanding what are the risks and impact that the company might have on others and that others might have on the company. And CS3D in that sense is not so much different than CSRD when it comes to defining stakeholders. I can just take our example, PwC, when we are preparing a CSRD report, and we've been engaging with ALFI. We've been engaging with ABBL. It's none of our clients, it's not a provider, but those are industry representative bodies with whom we have a strong interest to engage with, to understand also what they expect from us and what are the impacts that we have on them. So it goes beyond the pure client supplier to understand who are the communities again that I'm dealing with.
And I think it's interesting that you are engaging with those agencies. It's an informal way. In the initial drafting of the directive, they were suggesting the establishment of an advisory council, which would require that you really define who are these key stakeholders. So it'll be interesting to see as this develops, if these informal discussions actually turn into another body and formally recognized body of governance. So we'll see how that goes, Fred.
Yes, and I think that the council to me was a very interesting idea. Potentially difficult to put in place, but between us, the regret I have is that such councils usually are set up when it's too late.
Exactly.
In the sense that it's once a company has a big issue, or historically speaking, that's the way they've been, that happened. It's once a company have had a big issue that has started saying, okay, we're going to look at the people around us, and we're going to do what we have not done before, is engaging and understanding who we are and what we do, which again is too late, because historically speaking, when we've seen those things happening, it was after an unfortunate event happened.
Yeah, and I think that's that's the way things normally evolve. But I think it's another thing that as non-executives, we can be asking the question on how have the stakeholders been defined, and how is that informal discussion going, and is there any consideration for formal? Because maybe formal is not necessary. But I think, Fred, we're really moving on time. This is a topic, as you said, we can really discuss. But I think your next slide is going to address Sophie's question, asking about compliance be a competitive advantage. Well, no, there's been a lot of press on the pressure on the EU regarding this is a competitive disadvantage, and there's lots of administrative burden. So talk to us about the positive side.
Yes, I try to at least. On the admin burden, again, let's see how you have also this commitment from the Commission to reduce admin burden by 25%
Yes.
on companies. So let's see also how this will evolve into that concept of ID. Yet what we see, and you might say, okay, Fred, it's a bit of a wishy-washy and a wishful thinking, but let's see. The kind of benefits that we see is very much deriving from the fact that to deal with CS3D, a company has to ensure that they properly understand its value chain. And there is one direct impact to me, which is managing the brand reputation. If you understand who are the key stakeholders and the various material counterparts that you're operating with, you can manage the risk if something happens at one of those counterparts. Because again, the only thing you don't want to be is to be the corporate who is buying products from a company that is not doing right, because it will have an impact on you. So brand reputation, customer trust, investor trust, and that's the second point, is a point that where we'll see a benefit from CS3D. Investor trust is very much linked also to get access to more favorable financing condition, because again, that CS3D exercise forces corporates to best understand how they operate, who are they dealing with, how do they potentially put in competition certain of providers that are operating in the same field. So there is an overarching benefit to better understand and have a better mapping of all the various stakeholders, value chain elements, and so on and so forth, which might provide access to better financing conditions because the investor or the financer will have a greater trust into your operations. That has also an impact on risk management, very much linked to brand reputation being one of the risks. Having a better understanding of the risks and how that can be managed is obviously a key element. And the last 2 points, I will start with the last one, regulatory compliance. Well, it's a given. Yes, no. But being compliant from a regulatory standpoint is a key element. The other one, operational efficiency, again, better understanding the value chain might, if it's not done only in the sense of reporting, but really understanding the benefit of it, understanding of the benefit of reviewing my stakeholders, understanding how they operate, and so on and so forth, can lead to a revisit of certain operations and then leading to operational efficiency. I will just make the comparison with a discussion I had some time ago with a person who was managing director of hospitals in France. They say, you know, the person was very much into ESG and making sure that the group of hospitals he was managing was doing better in that sense. But he said, I never went to my board saying, guys, we're going to be greener and we're going to reduce electricity consumption. He said, I was going to my board, to my exco, saying, we're going to reduce electricity consumption because it will allow us to save on money first. And we will have also a more positive impact on the environmental matters. So it's also how you phrase and how you put things in perspective depending on the person you talk to. I see there's a question from Patrice, which I didn't have time to read.
Yeah, I'll quickly say on Patrice's, it's really about civil lawsuit and what kind of criteria. We're not going to have time to cover it, but I think one place to look would already be jurisprudence in France under their human rights
Yes.
directive, because there have been cases. So we can see some of the elements that are drawing, and we can take this offline. And the other is about what's the resources required to make our CS3D, CSRD operational? That's depends on size again, but are you seeing in Luxembourg any building up of teams? Or
as a good consultant, I would say it depends. Honestly, I cannot tell you for CS3D because for the time being, as we mentioned earlier on, companies and people are more focused on CSRD. So CS3D comes second when it comes to CSRD. Yet, if I look at what I see happening on CSRD, the number of resources range from 0 for companies that are failing at putting in place the proper framework. Well, many examples where the CSRD project is borne by legal, compliance, risk, marketing, you name it, and it comes just on top of their day-to-day work, knowing that they are not expert into that area. And I can tell you, in every single time, it fails. So more realistically, what we see is, again, depending on the size and depending on the size of the operations of the company, it takes 1 to 3, 4 FTEs for CSRD, especially because we're still into a building phase, to run the the topic, basically.
Well, Fred, I think I'm going to cut us off there because we've come to the top of the hour and we could keep going forever, I think, on this discussion. And it's great that we can have a discussion on this. So thank you for your time and thank you for your insights. To everyone else on the call too, remember that ILA does have a resource site on their website. It's up again. And the Sustainability Strategy Committee has created, it's a 10, 12 questions called a sustainability assessment template. And you can take a look at it. And what we've tried to do is to say, here's some of the key things that you as an individual, you as a board member, and you as a corporate should be looking at to see, are you ready to start this journey and be ready for the competitive advantages that can be offered. So with that, I close. Thank you to ILA for hosting us. Thank you to Fred for his time, to the Sustainability Committee for the support on this. And have a nice weekend, everyone. And let's enjoy the environmental changes with the snow. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.